Hello, 你好. I am Amanda Hsiung-Blodgett, Miss Panda. Welcome to interview with Miss Panda on Google Hangout on Air today. And my special guest today is Pamela Rose. Pamela is a Mandarin teacher and she loves teaching Mandarin and she loves to share her passion for Chinese culture and Chinese history with her students. And welcome, Pamela.
Hi, how are you?
Very good. We're happy to have you here to share your bilingual story with us. Why don't we start talking about your bilingual or multicultural background when you were growing up?
Sure. So I actually have a Chinese mom who was born in China and grew up in Taiwan. But when I was growing up, we really spoke only English due to sort of factors that weren't really controlled by my parents. And so I grew up monolingual with knowing around I was 8 or 9, knowing that I was this Chinese, half Chinese, but didn't really understand what that meant. Didn't understand that it was a language. And then I became curious, and I would hear my mom speak Mandarin to her mom and to my aunts, but I really didn't. I didn't speak it myself, and I was very curious, and I wanted to learn. It wasn't available to me in my school. I think the first time I actually had the chance to learn a world language was in middle school in 7th grade, and we had two options. We could either do French or Spanish. The idea of having Mandarin didn't exist back then. And actually, when I was in high school, I transferred to a private high school, and they didn't have Mandarin, and I begged every year for Mandarin classes. So I basically, when I was able to go to the Chinese weekend school starting at the age of 15, I begged and begged and begged my mom, and I basically she drove me. Eventually I drove myself when I turned 16. But I was 15 years old, and I was with a group of first graders in Chinese weekend school. That's how much I wanted to learn. It really was that important for me. And so that was the beginning of my Mandarin language journey. And then I eventually chose my university, the University of Chicago. This is the warmest thing I have tonight. So, but the University of Chicago, I chose it actually based on the Mandarin program. They had at that time one of the best Mandarin programs around, and it was one of the biggest reasons why I applied to the University of Chicago. It was also a great school, a top school. So I then continued my Mandarin studies at that point at the University of Chicago. I went abroad both to China and Taiwan when I was in university. And then actually, because of the language, ended up becoming an East Asian studies major and took a Chinese art history course because I thought it would fulfill a credit, and I thought it was, somewhat interesting. And I fell in love. I fell in love with Chinese art and art history. And it just kind of all came together. So I double majored actually in Chinese art history and East Asian studies. And thought I was going to go and be a Chinese art curator. So when I graduated, I actually interned at the Met, at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. It was then I got a job there, and I realized I really liked interacting with people. And I said to myself, what could I do? And the idea of being a Mandarin teacher didn't quite come to me. I never thought that I could actually be a Mandarin teacher. I didn't
I
think
have a
that was
question.
possible.
Yeah, I have a question right now. Is it because it's quite interesting, fascinating story, because you talk about your mom actually is Chinese, and then you heard her speaking Chinese when you were little, but you basically grew up in a monolingual,
I did,
family.
and Chinese weekend school was wonderful, but it really was only sort of a taste. You don't learn a lot when you only have a Chinese class 2 hours once a week. It was a good exposure. It was like what we call now in the lower in elementary school a flex program,
Yes. Yeah.
exploratory. That really was what it was for me. But it spurred me to go and choose the university that I did, and to continue trying to study Mandarin.
Right. And how did you talk to your mom? You know, so you were speaking to her in English, but how about in your family setting is like Chinese food, Chinese festivities and all that? Is it still a part of your family culture,
Yeah,
even though,
when I
you know,
was
the language was not spoken in your family?
Well, when I was growing up, we up until I was about 5, we didn't do as much. But then, when my father's parents had both passed on, we spent a lot more time with my mom's parents, or my mom's mom, my grandmother. And that's when I think there was more Chinese culture, just simply because I was around my Chinese grandmother, who I could not communicate to because she only spoke Mandarin. She didn't speak any English. We only kind of communicated through sign language and everything. Um, but I think that was sort of that culture aspect of it was something that I grew up with, but took for granted to some degree because it it was just around me. I never. It's funny. It wasn't until I, as an adult, who went to live in Asia, in China and Taiwan, when I began to understand my mom a lot better, and to understand the things that happened to me as a kid, or things that we did as a kid. We did go to Chinatown and to Flushing, Chinatown, a lot. I grew up in the New York City area, in the suburbs out here.
Yeah.
So Flushing was convenient to us. And we would go. By the time I was 5 or 6, my grandmother was living in Elmhurst, which is near Flushing. We'd be going to Flushing once a week, and we get our Chinese groceries and whatnot. And so I think that just became a normal part of my life. I didn't view it as unique. It was just what I was used to. And it's funny now because I don't live in an area currently that has good Asian or Chinese supermarkets. It's actually a desert out here. I live in this little triangle. I call it this triangle of these 3 highways, and there's like nothing. I have to like cross one of the highways in order to get any
Yeah.
decent Chinese food. And I miss it. And I miss it because it was just so readily part of my life growing up. So I think that's actually something that I don't think about, but now that you bring it up as a question, it is important. I think making it a part of my everyday life just was the best thing for me, because I just never thought about it any other way. It was a habit.
Right.
You went every week to the Chinese supermarket.
Right.
My mom had lots of little bamboo plants around the house. Things that she did, things that she cooked. They were because my grandmother was there, or because she enjoyed it.
Right.
So yeah, so food is a big part of it. I think in my family, it happens to be a big part of it. Um, but and Chinese art. My mom was always very into art, and so I got a taste of sort of calligraphy and shufa and other things like that. And
Right.
actually, I was inspired my senior year of high school to do an independent study project, and I studied guohua. So I
Mm.
studied shanshui hua. And I loved it. I actually found a teacher in Queens, and I would go once a week, and this was my study, and I loved it. And that was actually and that was before I could really speak well. And so my Chinese teacher, my Guohua teacher, didn't speak English very well, but she didn't have to. She would just show me, how
Yes.
to do things. And it's interesting because now that I'm sort of thinking about it, it was a huge part of sort of the cultural aspect of my life that it was just what I did.
Yeah.
But it I think has shaped me and shaped how I present culture and language to my students now.
Right. And I think, you know, also because you're half Chinese, half American, and then I think that actually now like when we talk about, different perspectives. And I think now you think everything is put together. But and that's definitely quite interesting. And also, then you decided to go to Taiwan, and then you took the challenge to study for your master's degree in Taiwan, the Taiwan Normal University, Shifan Daxue, and being an international student. Is that correct?
Yeah, that was actually a little bit after I decided. As I was saying before, I had gone. The thought was I would be this curator of Chinese art. And I went through working at the Met and realized I really wanted to teach. So I went back to Columbia to take, do coursework in both language. So I was working again on my Chinese language in really intensive classes. And I did a summer abroad in Taiwan. So these were important things, but I still didn't know what I wanted to do with it. I kept thinking, oh, I'll do more academic work. I'll teach in the college. I don't think it ever dawned on me at that point I could be a Mandarin teacher.
Right.
But I did get some idea that maybe I could teach in high school, history, social studies, East Asian studies, because that was becoming courses that were becoming popular in high schools. So I decided to just go back to Taiwan. I got a scholarship to study for a year for intensive language. And because I realized anything I was going to do was going to involve Mandarin somehow. It was going to involve the language.
Right.
And so I ended up going to Taiwan, and within a few weeks of that, met an old friend whose girlfriend, this is, one of those things where you meet somebody whose girlfriend was in this master's program. And I asked her, what are you studying? She goes, teaching Chinese as a second language. Yeah. And I just looked at her because she's Italian. She's a Westerner. And I looked at her and I said, but you're not Chinese. and she just laughed and she goes, no, the department really wants Westerners. They want, non-native Chinese speakers to take the program and go back to their home countries. And it was a light bulb moment for me.
Right.
Because I was like, oh, doing. And my language teachers at the language school that I was still at the time were very supportive of it. And actually some of them were my classmates in the master's program later on, because they would go back and to get their master's. So I became an international student in Taiwan at Shida, National Taiwan Normal University, in the Teaching Chinese as a Second Language program.
Right.
And it was
I want to say something so funny, because it's such a good story, because international students, well, right now we're in the States, New York area, in New Jersey, we're here in Washington, D.C. Well, I mean, we see international students everywhere,
right,
from all over the world. They all come over here. They might study a little bit English, and they move on to study bachelor's or master's or even PhDs. But, talking about having Western students to be in Taiwan or China, I think back then probably there were not a lot of students were able to take that challenge because the language barrier. So from the language program in Shida, National Taiwan University, to transfer into real academic study in the university, what was the challenge for you at the time?
Oh, it was challenging. All of it was challenging. I think, I was an advanced language student in advanced studies at ICLP, which was at NTU. And so you're doing a textbook, it's essays, but it's a textbook.
Yes.
And then and I had no background in linguistics. I had a background in East Asian studies. And then I ended up in this program that is sort of half linguistics classes and half pedagogy. And most of I'd say at least 60 to 70% of the readings, the texts, are linguistic. Well, one, they're in Chinese, and two, they're linguistics and they're pedagogy, two areas that I had never studied before. So
right, a lot of terminologies, basically. Yes.
And so it was like a kind of a crash course in linguistics and pedagogy. And luckily I did read a lot in Chinese, and it did get here's what it did. It forced me really quickly to get really good at specific strategies in reading and in reading Chinese. And that was something that I don't think I could have done without that sort of motivation right here of you have to finish this class this semester.
Yes. I know it's really interesting because, well, like you said, when you were in high school, you didn't take Chinese. You took Chinese from the weekend Chinese school to start with. Is that right?
Right. And I took it in college and it was intense. And I did study abroad in college. But again, it's that level of Chinese, which is where my students are at now. That's a beginner level. And then even to get to the advanced level in a college setting, you're still with the sort of textbook academic language. Then you're using very specific language in these linguistics books that are in Chinese. Luckily, there was some text, some readings that were in English, which was helpful because what I would do is I'd actually kind of translate the vocabulary. And so that actually helped me a lot.
That was a lot of learning also, as a matter of fact.
Yeah, it was
actually. I probably did the same thing when I was in college here in the States.
Yeah. So, and then of course there's the writing. So then I was learning to like write an essay in Chinese and write, and take, I would say these little tasks, and other activities and projects that we had to do, and working with my Taiwanese classmates, which that actually was quite a challenge. That was a intercultural challenge, because here I was not really fully understanding the culture. Yes, I grew up with a Chinese mom, but I grew up in America. I'm American. And I'm from New York. We're very direct here. In New York, we're in the East Coast, Northeast in particular. You feel something, you say something. You don't hold back. And Taiwanese culture, particularly mainland Chinese culture, is a little different. They're more direct. Actually, in the North, particularly where I studied,
yes,
it was actually not as difficult with these kind of cultural. I would call them conflicts at times in Taiwan, and especially with my Taiwanese classmates, where there's a great phrase. My professor in my program told me, in Taiwan, it's yes means yes and yes means no. They don't know how to say no. And I had to learn read between the lines. And it was really difficult. It was actually one of the biggest challenges in my program. And that's a cultural difference.
Absolutely. I think it's more like cross-cultural understanding, learning at the same time, I believe,
So I definitely I definitely learned a lot in that respect. What else? I think that academically, the biggest challenge of all was the thesis. I had to write a minimum of 100 pages in Chinese. And I should add that
I need to say it again in Chinese. Thesis in Chinese, at least minimum of 100 pages. That's very good. How did you handle that?
Mine was actually 150 because when I did my thesis defense, one of the advisor was like, "No, you have to add all of this." And so I had to add an extra, I think 40 pages. I had 110 and I had to add another 40. But I think people, particularly Americans, should be aware that one page of English is 2 pages of page of typed Chinese is 2 pages of typed English. So I was writing a ton. It was just really, that was a huge learning curve. I took other written thesis papers that I had found, and I looked to see the format, because the format for writing them was very specific. There's almost like a formula of how you write, and how you write is not how you even write in an essay or in a novel. And so that was a huge learning curve. I had to do a lot of that. And then of course, having to add 40 pages at the end. I still to this day, I think I can't believe I wrote it and then I graduated.
Well, that's a big achievement. And then I think, and then that actually, well, I'm going to ask something very interesting. So, what was your favorite food when you were in Taiwan, and what was your favorite place to go when you were in China? Well, let's do a little bit, fun things first.
Oh, food, that's just not a fair question because in Taiwan, like there was so much that I loved. I miss the what is it called? It's Bing, but it's the pulled one. The is it
Dropping.
dropping? Yeah, the dropping. I love the dropping with the egg and the
Mm-hmm.
basil.
Yeah.
And I would it was not good for you to have more than like once once a month, but I loved it. And the breakfast foods like douhua and
The bean curd.
doujiang and youtiao
Yeah.
and those sort of things. That's what I remember the most. And zimi fan tuan. I think if I'm going to say anything in Taiwan as a favorite food, it's su the zimi fan tuan.
That you well, you probably need to explain that because that's
Oh
some
yeah.
kind of rice ball, and it was all the goodies inside for
Yeah,
breakfast.
so it's a
Yeah.
I have I ate the vegetarian version of what's called zimi, is purple rice, and fantuan is like a rice roll with all kinds of goodies inside. In my case, I would have the sort of crunchy, there's like a crunchy youtiao
Yeah,
and
like a churro in a way, kind of like
yeah, kind of
similar.
like a churro. Yeah, inside the
Yeah.
rice, inside the rice, and oh, God, what else is there? Scallions, all kinds of goodies, and I just loved it, especially purple rice.
Right.
I could eat that every day, and in fact, the last time I went back to Taiwan to visit, I searched like high and low for this because you can't just get the purple rice anywhere. It's actually a little bit rare to find. Usually you'll have the white rice. And I every day went out and searched for it. Not every day I found it. And sometimes they sold out. And I was so upset.
Yes, yes, I know. I know. This is very interesting. Food in Taiwan is amazing. And yes, you do have to search for the food you love, and you need to
Right.
get early and line up so you can get it. Yes.
Yeah, and people, it's like kind of like in places in like New York and LA, when people really like something, they line up for it. They really do. And you'll see lines everywhere in Taiwan for like really popular places, and usually it's worth the wait. It really is. So that's basically, I think that's my favorite, but it's really unfair because there's just, I mean, the last time I went back to Taiwan, I only got to go back for a couple weeks. And I swear, I just kept, all I would do is I'd walk outside, I'd eat a little something, I'd walk a little more, I'd eat something else. Everything looked so good. I just wanted this, and this, and this. And so it's really hard to say what's my favorite.
Well, I can relate, but I have to throw that question. So, it's a big culture. A lot of times I think what you said, when we talk about culture in school, a lot of times we only touch the very top, the surface.
Yeah,
The food is a surface, but if you go deep in, actually why it is made like that, why it's purple rice, why they put different things inside. I think you start to see a more authentic and a very deep inside kind of a research of the food and then relationship between food and the culture from a family perspective or the society.
totally.
Yeah, so
And
that's very interesting. So okay, well, I'm going to ask you about your research actually when you were doing your thesis because
mhm,
I'm big with stories. I love stories. I teach my
right.
kids in the story style. I teach my students with stories, and then your theme on your research when you were doing the Chinese teaching Chinese a second language study. Tell us about your research on TPRS. What is it? Yes.
So TPRS stands for Teaching Proficiency through Reading and Storytelling, and it's based. It was actually developed by a man named Blaine Ray, who still does workshops, and you can find those workshops around the country. And he developed his ideas about teaching languages based on the theory of language acquisition by Dr. Stephen Krashen, called comprehensible input. And basically the idea is that language is acquired when it's made comprehensible, and that you add another piece little by little, and all the big structures of the language as well, to develop acquisition and proficiency. And Blaine Ray took that and he developed sort of this sort of 3 or 4, I'd say now it's a 3-step method, to take storytelling, and I would say the storytelling moniker is kind of a misnomer. It's really story asking. You're kind of co-creating a story with your students, and by doing so, students are actually not really focused on, they're hearing the same structures, the same language again and again, repeatedly, but in different ways, and sometimes in unpredictable ways. And they're really, their engagement is on the story. When we think about the sort of the things that we remember the most, there's always a story behind it. And I think that's the way our brains are wired as humans. That's just how language is wired in our head, is through stories. And so Blaine Ray took this method and he developed this method, and other teachers now, and Blaine Ray actually is a Spanish teacher. And a lot of Spanish teachers now in the United States are beginning to use this method, and there are some sort of branching off methods. So when I actually was looking for a thesis topic, I somehow heard of this method, looked into it. I was in Taiwan. I didn't have a lot of material on it. I had whatever I could get on the internet. But it seemed interesting enough to me, but more importantly, it was practical. It was a thesis topic that I could then apply in my own teaching. And I think for me, that was really, really important. I didn't want to do something linguistics based. Studying why does the word Joe always in this type of sentence did not really interest myself as a teacher. So I started to do some research on it, and I ended up writing a thesis that was basically somewhat of a curriculum design, teaching material design for ages K to 5, so elementary school, using TPRS as sort of the main vehicle of teaching. So I did a lot of analysis of textbooks, both TPRS textbooks in Spanish, and I believe all I had access to at that time was Spanish. And then I looked at Chinese textbooks, traditional ones. And so I did some comparison and analysis. And that's kind of where my research started with my thesis. To be very honest with you, I don't think I've really used any of my thesis, which is very common amongst graduate students. But it did get me further along in understanding TPRS, and it was the beginning of my journey as a CI, comprehensible input based language teacher.
Absolutely, but I think that this is something very interesting. I want to touch on, to the fellow teachers and parents that are watching this, because I think when we talk about stories, TPRS, as we said, is teaching proficiency through reading and storytelling. That means you tell stories and then you engage the students, be a part of the story, asking questions, and then add things into the story. So the story maybe has a structure, bone, but the students are giving and learning and giving the content at the same time. So it's not the teacher's story, it's the student's story. That's why it is so engaging and an important and powerful way to learn. So so how did you learn Chinese when you were younger? I think we all learn language in a way, like remember the grammar, remember the vocabulary. So let's do a little bit of comparison so people can understand.
Sure. I think traditionally, the way Chinese has been taught, and the way I was taught, was that you were given a set of vocabulary, you were given grammar patterns, and you were told to go to the language lab and repeat, say it and repeat, listen to it and repeat. And that's a very explicit way of teaching a language. But language isn't explicit, it's implicit. And I think that's the key to the storytelling methods, is that they are having students learn implicitly and hearing the language in context. And so that's really important, so that to understand that the way that traditionally, or what we call legacy methods of teaching, really are very much focused on repetition and memorizing. I mean, I can't tell you how many times I've written out the word "duh" or "war" or whatnot, and handwriting again and again on those little squares, right? And what I've discovered through my learning process as a teacher, through TPRS and through an adaptation for Chinese literacy called cold character reading, CCR, which was developed by a Chinese teacher, language teacher and trainer, Terry Waltz, Dr. Terry Waltz. Those methods have made it much more effective and efficient for students to really acquire the language, because they're acquiring the structures, the really key structures, and they're building on that. And the storytelling is allowing them to acquire it without having what the linguists call the affective filter, without having the sort of the feeling that they're memorizing and that they're struggling. They're not struggling through acquiring the language anymore. They're just engaging with it,
right?
And engaging in a story. It's sort of, I call it a little bit of a it's like a hack. It's a hack into acquiring a language without you knowing.
That actually is very true. That is very true, because they don't know they're actually creating a story with the words, vocabulary, sentences they actually have already acquired. I think that's the thing we say, acquire the language so they can apply to it.
Yes. And that's the difference between, there's a huge difference between acquisition and learning. Learning is like you're learning about the language, you're learning the grammar pattern. And that doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be able to then use it spontaneously in communication. What my goal as a teacher is to have my students really acquire the language so that they can actually communicate. And actually, I was just we're now on break as of today, but my students were telling me the other day that, they actually Snapchat to each other in Chinese, in Mandarin.
Yes.
Like they'll like do a little story and start and Snapchat to each other, because they know the language. They're just communicating and they're using it. And I just thought that was so brilliant. I couldn't believe they were Snapchatting it.
That is because they are having a great time with the language. They're having fun. So they want to use it. They are not forced to memorize a sentence pattern, but because they have already acquired it, so they are able to produce. And I think that's the key point, because a lot of times we want to see kids to say to produce it, but they're not ready to produce it. That's the key. I think that's the very interesting key point you just mentioned, when your students are able to use the Snapchat and to, do a story on Snapchat in Chinese.
Yeah, I think that's the key, is that they're having fun. They're engaging with it because they want to, because they're confident. They're confident in their language skills and in their proficiency. They may not be able to say, really, really advanced level things, but they're microfluent.
Yes.
They're microfluent. I think that's a Terry Waltz phrase that she uses. They're microfluent in what they know, and they can really converse and communicate.
Right. And
both with me and with,
Yeah, well, yes, definitely. Dr. Terry Waltz, her book is fabulous. So I'm going to include that in my in the notes, so people can find her book. For the fellow teachers, I think it's a very useful. That's very important. I also think that because as a Western culture learner, and then you go into the Chinese language, I think you see the language in a different perspective. I think that's probably very helpful. A lot of people say, oh, I need to find a native Chinese speaking teacher. And I said, well, sometimes you should try the non-native Chinese teachers, because they have a total different perspective, and then they can bring a different whole level of knowledge of the language.
I think there's an element of that. You know, a lot of times a good example of that is my students will ask me a question, you know, 张老师, why is blah, 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 blah. And I'll give them a comparison or an answer that's usually, well, it's this, this, and this. And it's, when you're not a native speaker of a language, you've learned the sort of aspects of the language from the outside in. So I'm able to explain it very clearly. Whereas with English, if you ask me why, you know, the word as is added to certain phrases, and that's I don't know, this is a random example, I can't tell you. But if you add a non-native speaker of English, that person may actually be able to tell you, you know, again, it's how you approach the language. If you're a Westerner who's learned Mandarin, or non-native speaker who's learned Mandarin, you're going to have a very different perspective of the language and the culture too. Yes. A huge part of culture is that cross-cultural comparison, the comparison of my students' American culture. And sometimes, you know, I have students, it's a relatively diverse school. Well, it's, you know, different backgrounds, right? So I have a student maybe who's from a South Asian background, or one student who's from a Hispanic background. Well, they have different cultures. So I'm actually balancing all these different kind of cultural comparisons, both for them and then to Chinese culture. So it's important for me as a language, and I think of myself not just as a language teacher, but also as a culture teacher. But it's important for me to bring that in and compare it to their own culture.
Absolutely.
It's critical, because they need to be able to make that connection. Yes. And but at the same time, you know, I am a language teacher, so language comes first. But I want them to have that cultural background knowledge, because they're most of the time they're curious. They are curious. I have middle school students, and middle school students tend to ask questions a lot. It's not like high school. And it's probably one of the reasons why I'm a middle school teacher, is that in high school, you know, you get the kids in the back who are like, I'm not going to talk. Ignore me. I want the teacher to ignore me. But in middle school, you get a lot of that. You get kids who are just, you know, question after question. Sometimes where, you know, I have to say, okay, ask me after class.
Yes. Yeah. I think curiosity is good. Curiosity always leads to more knowledge, you know, no matter they're finding on their own or from the teachers. So now this actually leads to my next question. That will be, what do you want to say to your students and all the other students, young students, and maybe in middle school, in high school, and they are learning Chinese right now?
I think most of all is to understand that the way that you're learning Mandarin, especially if you're with a teacher who's a Western or a non-native speaking teacher, take advantage of that. Take advantage of even if it's a native speaking teacher, take advantage of their knowledge. They're an expert in what they do, and be able to just take it in. If you're in a more traditional class, which is, you know, very much possible, try to listen. Listening is key. I think with a lot of language classes, there's a lot of emphasis on output, on speaking, on writing, but without input, without the listening and without the reading, we can't get output. And so I think for a lot of students, they feel like they have to like speak and they have to write. And actually the key is really to read and to listen. Listening, especially I think for Mandarin, is key.
That's definitely very important. I would talk about a lot of input. You know, listen to the stories, audiobooks. I love audiobooks. Huh?
Yeah.
Watch the shows. Now internet is so convenient for us. You can watch shows in Chinese, on YouTube or Netflix, podcasts, right? So
yeah, those are really great ideas, actually. And podcasts. There's actually a number of podcasts that you can listen to. I recommend Chinese Pod is one, which is pretty good, and Melnick's Chinese, I think, is another, which is also pretty good. I think Chinese with Mike is a YouTube channel. Ones are great because there's so much visual. So you're listening, but you're seeing the visual aspects of animation, which are there's a lot more information in the visuals than if it was live action.
right, and so that's great. So today we're more targeted at the older students. Of course, you teach in middle school right now, and my kids now middle school and high school. So we passed the little bit different kind of a stage. So I think it's great, for our parents and teachers, and they're watching right now. So you can see we're focused on the older students right now. So
I have one thing.
Yes, go ahead.
Sorry, I have one thing to add. One of the keys, I think, for older kids, and even my own students too, I do this as well, is figuring out what's interesting to you. So if you're really into art, or if you're really into sports, finding, for example, there are videos online of soccer games, like football games in Mandarin with sportscasters, Mandarin speaking sportscasters. So if you're really into sports, that's something to do, is to watch the game in that language, in that target language. But finding things that are interesting to you is really key, because you're going to stay interested. You've got already an interest in that topic. When we try to read for reading's sake, boring very quickly, and you're not as motivated. So I do this even with my middle school students, because I've tried to find stories. I try to find material that's interesting to them. I take a survey of their interests, and I will plug some random singer that they really like. I'll plug his name into a story because they want to see it. They think it's funny. And I have to say, Justin Bieber pretty much gets thrown under the bus in every single story.
That's a very good one, actually. Yeah, even people they don't like him, they still want to hear it in the story, in Chinese story. Absolutely.
Yeah. So that is really important. I just wanted to add that.
Sure, that's really good. So we're going to wrap it up. So I'm going to ask you to talk about your top tip as a bilingual multicultural teacher. Some tip for the parents who are on this bilingual parenting journey. What's your, something you want to say to them to help them to, carry this on after they, watch this show, and then something they can apply in everyday life and raising their children in two languages, English and Chinese, or another community language?
I think patience. It's hard as a parent. I can only imagine that, how much lack of patience you have sometimes, but patience. I think a lot of parents revert to one language. They don't continue to do the bilingual sort of route. It's a lot of work. It's a lot of patience. And remember that the input is key. The input is critical. So if it's just the kids sort of responding back in, for example, if you're speaking to them in, say, Spanish, and they're responding back in English, which is the language that's surrounding them in school and home and outside.
Yeah, the community language.
That in the community. That's okay. As long as they're hearing it and they're responding correctly, and that they're comprehending, that's comprehensible input. And that's key. That's really, because down the road, they will probably come to a point like a lot of my friends did, which is, I should probably learn my parents' language, or learn this this part of my culture, my heritage. And so they'll do it as an adult, or maybe in college or in high school. But if you try to force it on them, and force them to speak, sometimes that backfires. So I always recommend parents to just keep the patience up and keep speaking, and just speak and speak and speak. And don't worry too much about whether they're responding in your language or not, in the target language. It'll come to them eventually.
Yeah, I think that's something very interesting you mentioned, because I think a lot of times, because the kids actually, they're not responding to you in the target language. Here is the Chinese, Mandarin Chinese. It's because they don't have the vocabulary, because
Right.
they are not reading enough, they're not hearing enough, so they might understand parts and bits of it, but they cannot really produce it. So I think that also shows that they need to have more Chinese in their life or in their environment.
Yeah, and more of that input. And I had this is a sort of a side suggestion. A friend of mine, what she did with her young son was that she would say, because they all want to go on, watch TV or play on their iPads now. I mean, this is the digital generation. And she said to her son, she said, you can get an extra half an hour, but it has to be a Mandarin cartoon or show. And she basically said that that's your only option for that extra half an hour. And so she has a collection of these CDs and some streaming and whatnot, television shows and a lot of cartoons. And he just gets an extra half an hour. And the nice thing about the television shows is that she can cut off the English subtitles. And I think at the time when she started this, he was so young that his English wasn't really good enough to read it. So that's another option for parents.
Right. I think it's a great idea. So parents are trying so hard, all the strategy tips, try to use whatever we can learn from other people and then apply it in our daily life. Okay. So Pamela, is there anything you want to say to your students in Chinese right now? Okay, you might test that. No.
我希望我的学生永远学习中文，永远喜欢学中文，永远对中文有兴趣。
Thank you so much, Pamela.
中文文化有兴趣。
Okay, you want to say it again? Sorry.
对中文文化也有兴趣。
So it's a whole language. It's not just the language itself, it's the culture.
Yeah,
it's
beyond Chinese language and culture.
Exactly. The language is a part of culture, of course.
Yes.
So it's a whole language, whole culture. So thank you so much, Pamela, for joining us today.
不客气。
谢谢你，非常谢谢你。Thank you very much, Pamela, for sharing your valuable bilingual story with us and then your inside information as a Mandarin teacher. It was fantastic. Oh. And for you, our wonderful audience, thank you for watching this episode of Interview with Miss Panda. Have a wonderful day, and I'll see you next time. 再见，我们下次见。